Do you think the regime wants this war to end, or does it actually benefit from it?
There's a group which sees continued confrontation not only as necessary, but actually good for the regime.
Conventional wisdom is Iran is stronger today than it was in before this all started.
Iran has performed better, and by weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz, it's partially restored its deterrence.
Fair to say that for no one this is going according to plan, perhaps with the exception of the Iranians.
So the question is, does the regime seriously have to think about building a nuclear deterrent for its survival?
Big news, as always, certainly this year, coming out of Iran. We've had some big leadership changes, and the world is trying to make sense of them. Every decision that's made at the leadership level in Iran affects everybody on the planet these days. So we had some big changes, IRGC on the rise, hardliners on the rise. Farzan, what's going on in your view? Is there a shift happening? Are they hardening their attitude? What does the rise of these people, the changes, actually mean for Iran and for the rest of us?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, you've had an unprecedented level of leadership attrition in the Islamic Republic. I can't really think of another modern war, let alone even an ancient war, where so many of the top political and security leadership of a political regime have been taken out in the opening days of a conflict. If you think between 2020 and now, there's been a significant level of attrition. And that attrition, of course, is at the first and second kind of tier of leadership. But, given the larger set of strikes that have happened, it probably also affects lower ranks within the regime. So what we believe Mojtaba Khamenei, the kind of supposedly the new supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, has done is make several new appointments and to replace people who were basically killed either during the 12-day war or much more recently during the last round of war that's happened between February and April 2026.
The theory of the case on the 27th of February was that you hit hard at the top, you succeeded in sort of removing the top tier leadership, and then the theory of the case was then the regime would crumble. And not only, as Farzan just really kind of explained in great detail and insight, have you had the bench step up and they go 5 down on each rung, but it seems to me from the outside, you have greater kind of regime coherence and strategic coherence than it seemed like you had, again, on February 27th, where you could have said, well, these factions here are more kind of interested in ensuring that Iran is economically stable, maybe comes back economically. These guys are a little bit more inclined to strike diplomatic deals. But not only have you had this other layer come up, but again, it seems from the outside, and correct me if this is a apprehension, you have a much more kind of determined and even kind of clear-eyed strategically regime in place than you had on February 27th.
Listen, what I would say is that the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the previous supreme leader, he bought into this the system or the regime's kind of theory of confrontation with the U.S. to expel the U.S. from the Middle East and from the Persian Gulf, as well as kind of pursuing the destruction of Israel. At the same time, he wanted to take a more gradualist approach, and he understood that in the meantime, in order for the regime to survive, you also had to kind of manage the economy and maintain some level of social stability. But the broad trajectory we've seen the regime and Iran itself face, and I would kind of put the start date on this of this part of the clock on like almost November 2016 when Trump gets elected, but really after he pursues maximum pressure, starting in mid 2018, you had this kind of downward trajectory. And during that time, you've seen the economy deteriorate significantly due to sanctions and other factors. You've seen the domestic political legitimacy of the system decline. And you've had several rounds of popular uprisings, which, unlike the 2009 Green Movement, which was essentially at its core a kind of reformist movement, where is my vote? People were trying to pursue change through the system, even if with some level of kind of radical changes. The protests that we saw beginning with, September 2017, January 2018, were really coded with kind of a regime change elements. And you've seen those sets of protests intensify over time. And you've seen these protests return cyclically. So in a period of 8 years since 2018, you've had on average one major popular uprising every 2 years, right? And of course, the acts of resistance, after the 7th of October, has also collapsed almost front by front. This is a strategy that Israel deliberately pursued. And so you had Syria, the Syrian front collapse. You've had Hezbollah severely degraded. Hamas effectively is on the verge of defeat. The Iraqi Shia militias, specifically the Islamic resistance in Iraq, are under pressure to disarm. The Houthis are really the only ones that are relatively intact. And so
And
Iran's
yet,
kind of system
despite
of
all
deterrence
this,
has collapsed.
the conventional wisdom is Iran is stronger today than it was in before this all started, before this campaign started February 27th, and before actually maybe October 7th. Is that a misapprehension of what's going on, or is that actually the reality?
So here's, I think it's a bit of a misapprehension, and this is how I'd characterize it. That we've seen this arc, right, over the last kind of 10 years or 8 years, however you want to say that, it kind of just laid out, right? Obviously, Iran's approach wasn't working, right? And I think even if Khamenei and those leaders who were assassinated after the 20th of February, right, or on the 20th of February onward, were alive, they would have to make a change in strategy, right? Because what they were doing wasn't working. And so I would say that the regime is not necessarily more cohesive, or as some have described, more radical. They're just confronting the reality, right? Which is that if they do not respond, right, and they don't attempt to somehow reestablish deterrence, then they're basically at the mercy of the U.S. and Israel. And so what I would characterize is that we had this broad arc in the last two episodes. So the war from the February through April, and then this most recent episode since the collapse of the MOU, Iran has performed better, and by weaponizing the Strait of Hormuz, it's partially restored its deterrence. So it's in a stronger position now than it was before the 28th of February. The question is, is this partial restoration of deterrence, does it mean that it's now won the conflict, or that it's indefinitely on a better footing?
Two questions come to mind for that for me, and again, this is really I started with this. One is, what was the miscalculation by Trump and Bibi? And two, what is, if anything, the calculation by let's say the people who are sort of, again, coming to this conventional view that the war has been a failure for the U.S. and Israel?
My sense is that, first of all, the U.S. and Israel were not really aligned on their goals. Israel seems to have been pursuing much more openly regime change, or at least some form of kind of state collapse and civil war, whereas the U.S. was open to regime change if it happened after day one, but it was more favorable towards this idea of what I call regime modification, which is we decapitate at the top and do business with what's left. It's what they had done in Venezuela. It seemed to work pretty well there. And I think part of the miscalculation came from the experience of the 12-day war. And so the idea was that, well, on the one hand, it worked well in Venezuela, so we're going to do a bigger version. We're going to pull out all the stops to some extent, right? And at the same time, they've come at us. They've given a limited response before, and they took that as a signal of weakness. And that's the lesson that the Islam Republic kind of learned the hard way. And so their calculus was that even if we don't get regime change or collapse after the initial opening operations, we can, in a series of weeks, I think the original operational timeline was 5 to 6 weeks, we can basically carve a new leadership at the top that's more willing to make concessions to us. And that factor that I would highlight is, those of us who've been in the business, and I'm sure this is true with Andres as well, knew about the kind of Hormuz option that Tehran had, which was its real nuclear option, right? Because it finally was not able to kind of build a nuclear deterrent. The question was, to what extent it could go all the way, and then to what extent the U.S. would be able to neutralize that. The information that I had going into the war and before the war was that the Trump administration and the U.S. military were aware of this issue and took countermeasures. When the war actually broke out, they didn't do any of the things that were kind of in the contingency planning, as far as I'm aware. So I think that the Trump administration made these miscalculations. One, that it would be a repeat of the 12-day war, and that this regime modification was much easier and comparable in a place like Iran as in Venezuela. And second, that all of the contingency planning that the U.S. military had done over a period of decades to prepare exactly for this scenario, they didn't really follow through with the key defensive elements of that to keep oil flowing through the strait.
Yeah, preparation wasn't maybe the sort of strong suit. I wonder, Andres, what since you track domestic Iran very closely as well, do you think that following what happened in sort of January, that the Iranian people were in any position to try again? I mean, it just seemed, if you're counting on kind of domestic upheaval, I don't know, maybe either it was 6 weeks too late or 6 months too early.
That's a very good question, Matt. I mean, and Faizan, jump in. I would say that this regime has really perfected over 47 years the art of controlling everything, right? And so one of the things that I heard people say, during the Masa Jina Amini protests and so on as well, there's no leader emerging. Well, you can't emerge as a leader. I mean, with the levels of control, the technology for, facial recognition, whatever, they can spot anybody who emerges. If they even survive, they end up in Evin prison. This is, the ability that people had in the late 70s to protest and so on, it just isn't there anymore because they can cut it off immediately. The will is clearly there. And so basically the people have to live with it. They can't organize. The internet is controlled. The levels of, ultimately have a regime that just set up machine guns and mowed people down. The will is certainly there, but the technology, I would say, is currently its tips in favor of the regime. And it's hard to see how they're just going to get better and better at it. They have technology that's not their own from other countries, and they've really perfected. It's shocking to see what they do. We don't really have good footage of what happened on January 8th and 9th, but we've certainly seen, they just run motorcycles into crowds. They do awful, awful things, as we know. And I would say that there was an understanding that the beginning of the war was about facilitating that type of change, and uh, they just didn't have the capacity to have it happen. Faizan, what do you think?
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I would highlight maybe 2 or 3 additional points. One is a general question, and I'm sure it's one maybe you struggle with in your work, both on Iran and elsewhere, is that in the current age with the advances in forensic and digital technologies, how much harder is rebellion than it was in Tsarist Russia or, pre-revolution kind of China or pre-79 Iran, right? I think it's in terms of the organizational element of detecting and snuffing out dissent before it ever reaches critical mass. Rebellion has become harder in many places where you have a relatively effective and well-organized state in place. And then when it comes to authoritarian regimes more generally, I kind of did basic military training, and I was kind of an infantry soldier, right? Maybe some of you have military training as well. A small but well-organized, well-armed, well-trained, disciplined, and ideologically motivated force can control and essentially dispatch a much larger population of unarmed, disorganized, untrained people.
By
Right?
the way, that's a really great point about it. I mean, this vindicates Morozov from 15, 16 years ago when during the sort of Arab Spring, we were thinking that technology is gonna liberate the world, or in
Yeah.
fact the opposite.
Yeah. The techno pessimist views
Yeah.
maybe.
It's come through. I think.
Yeah.
In China certainly, obviously.
If you get to whisper in the ears of, the small group of people who may be flying off to Islamabad or wherever it is they may be flying to from the US side, negotiating, trying to make these decisions, what do you think they need to know that maybe they're not getting? Is there a kind of a magic piece of wisdom that you wish if you were in the room you could whisper to them?
I think they probably have most of the information they need, and they're not going into the room with any blinders on, right? I think I was one of the kind of theories I had coming out of the war into the ceasefire is that there was a group around Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf who could try to initiate a transformative process of change in the Islamic Republic, because like we were talking about, I think the status quo, despite the Islamic Republic's better performance or even victories in the last two episodes, is unsustainable. And so I think there's part of the leadership that understands that it's unsustainable and might even be willing to initiate a process of change. And that means coming to terms with the United States and ending the conflict with the U.S., with Israel, getting comprehensive sanctions relief, and making the painful concessions from the perspective of the regime that are necessary. I don't think that group has never been well placed in the Islamic Republic. I've always been more of a pessimist, right? But I think they ended up being even weaker than I imagined, and they couldn't even fully kind of implement the IOM. Within a lot of the expert kind of circles, they blame the U.S. for MOU, not IOM. They blame the U.S. for the failure of the MOU, right? That the implementation of the MOU wasn't really tested. The moment Iran realized, and the Islamic Republic realized that they were losing control of the strait, just by virtue of the kind of reopening that was happening and the ceasefire, they decided it was more important for them to keep control of the strait. And a week after Vance and Ghalibaf had signed that agreement, they started launching attacks against ships. I think it was on the 25th of June. So it's a week after the 17th when they signed the deal, right? So that group that I think maybe overpromised to the Trump administration and to JD Vance, and on the other hand, the President Trump's kind of thesis or idea, he calls it regime change. I would say it's like regime kind of modification, right? It probably didn't work as well as he imagined. Ghalibaf, as much of an opportunistic figure as and power kind of seeking figure as he is, he's constrained by the broader system. And the IRGC, it was kind of dominant power before. It's even more empowered now. And so given the kind of confidence it's gained from its last two victories, I don't think it's going to be willing to make the kind of concessions that the Trump administration is looking for in the negotiations. And so I think that's going to make any kind of breakthrough beyond what we've already seen negotiated, and maybe outcomes that are even worse for the U.S. It's going to make the better outcomes for the U.S. Much more difficult.
Well, so then I have to ask, do you think the regime wants this war to end, or does it actually benefit from it?
Yeah, I think there's probably people are of two minds. So if you listen to the presidency, and and that related to that is kind of the foreign ministry, the planning organization, all the central bank, all the economic entities, they know the economic situation is quite dire. Now, it's not dire on any kind of imminent timeline, but you've had major former economic figures from within the regime and even kind of the mainstream economic press come out and give scenarios for example, let's say inflation, right? And they're potentially looking at some hyperinflationary scenarios for this calendar year, right? Let alone kind of projecting forward to the future if the conflict continues. And that's just kind of one aspect of things. People wake up sometimes and the price has changed dramatically and incomes are not really keeping up because the economy, because the country's taken severe damage and the economy is shrinking. So I think there's a part of the administrative apparatus which is not politically empowered that understands the situation is not sustainable. On the other hand, I think the kind of hardline elements that are firmly entrenched would favor continuation of the struggle. And if they get the kind of concessions they want, kind of their maximalist demands from the U.S., then great, it's a victory, but they're willing to concede very little. On the other hand, if it means continuing to resist in order not to concede on the things that they don't want to concede, and that includes, on the Strait of Hormuz today, on the nuclear issue, on the confrontation with Israel acts of resistance, they're willing to continue the struggle or at least reach an equilibrium where maybe it's not intensified warfare, but it's something they see as being able to sustain because they also see that as being vital for them to continue to hold on to power. So in a sense, I think it's an affirmation of what you say, which is there's a group which sees continued confrontation not only as necessary, but actually good for the regime.
And, what could peace even actually look like? We're not going to go back to February 27th. And so the question is, I mean, the landscape has changed, right? It's changed forever. We have new alignments. We have new, and unintended consequences. I'm reminded of when the full-scale invasion, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened. And basically one of the end results of it was that Finland and Sweden joined NATO, which was probably not one of the results that they had planned. what do you think some of the consequences of this war might be that we hadn't thought of in the West, and that, how might the scene change?
Regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, there's some insight from political science, which basically argues if a conflict lasts longer than X, and a conflict being, for example, in large-scale invasion, right? Let's say lasts longer than a year, right? It's likely to last several years, even a decade. I have to kind of look back to the data set and the political science papers that wrote that, but this kind of thesis exists. In the case of Iran, we're really dealing with kind of a large-scale air war, so I'm not sure if those insights from political science and study of conflicts quite apply. But it's possible that some form of low to medium intensity conflict is the new status quo, with flare-ups happening occasionally, ceasefires and resumptions of kind of economic activity that facilitate decrease in oil prices, some financial rebuilding of financial buffers for the Islamic Republic, and then breaking down over various causes. Whether it's breaking down over something that happens in and around the Strait of Hormuz, over something that happens between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, or between the Houthis and the Saudis, right? So some kind of low to mid intensity conflict could be the new status quo for the foreseeable future if we don't reach some kind of a sustainable deal that's implemented with further phases of negotiations that then come into play, right? Because remember, the MOU is supposed to be 60 days, and in the meantime, they were supposed to negotiate a longer term deal. It actually fared much worse than even me as a pessimist imagined it would. So that's the first kind of change, big or potential scenario we have in front of us going forward, maybe on a.
Coming back a little bit to your previous point too, is that I find it, conflicts are can be a way for authoritarian regimes to sustain themselves. I mean, it gives you a legitimizing narrative. It gives you an excuse to really repress without any consequences domestically, which is, still harder to do at a time of peace. And thirdly, yes, it's bad economically for the country as a whole, but it could be good economically for insiders who benefit from access to, smuggling routes, or can take advantage of the distortions that are created by the conflict better than regular people. So, it just seems to me like unfortunately, the history also shows you the only way to end a war is to actually defeat the authoritarian regime, and because otherwise they are fine with continued tension and instability, and that can be preferable to the end of that, because the end of that may start, and this is, I mean, certainly Vladimir Putin's calculation, cause problems domestically that currently he doesn't have to worry about.
Absolutely. You're right. I'll make 2 points kind of in responses. On your main point, I think that's absolutely correct, right? There's a basic math there, right? Which is authoritarian regimes don't just collapse, and neither do democratic regimes for that matter. Something has to kind of push them, right? And so there has to be an alignment of internal and external forces that is able to bring sufficient force to collapse the regime. And that means two things, kind of breaking the cohesion of the regime's elites so that they fight against one another or even join the other side to fight the regime, and the loss of control and the loss of cohesion of the security forces. As long as that math doesn't add up, a regime can stay in power theoretically indefinitely. The Bashar al-Assad regime stayed in power almost 15 years right after the Syrian civil war broke out because there wasn't a similar alignment of forces that was able to kind of break it. I think actually going back to the earlier discussion about the uprising, I think part of the theory of both the opposition as well as to some extent the Israelis and the US was that there was kind of going to be a sequence of events, which was popular uprising, military intervention, and that military intervention would be so shocking and so strong that it would then break the cohesion of elites and or their control of security forces, right? So it was a sequence of events. The first two parts of that formula happened. The third part didn't happen for various reasons. But I remember going back to the summer of 2025, during the 12-day war, I remember having some conversations in Tehran, hearing from people who were quite senior within the system, basically thinking that actually the only way for the country to be saved, if not the regime, was for its regime change to happen, right? So that doubt was there, but that sequence didn't really play out. And it goes to that gap that existed between when the popular uprising happened and when the intervention happened, potentially. We can only hypothesize. The kind of second point I lay out, or I would kind of say in response, is that you're absolutely correct. that again the regime can kind of stay in point indefinitely. But remember, Iran is a country that's experienced the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. It's been under sanctions for the better part of almost 50 years, approaching 50 years. It's been under sanctions for nearly the kind of post 9/11, more comprehensivized and financialized sanctions for almost 20 years. I did a working paper with colleagues at MIT, which estimating the counterfactual kind of economic damage of the sanctions regime from 2010 to 2020. It was estimated at being the macroeconomically equivalent to the Iran-Iraq War. So Iran experienced basically the macroeconomic damage of an 8-year war without actually having experienced that war. And we've been seeing for at least since the 2020s the signs of state failure, whether that's around water, whether that's around electricity, whether that's around, before the popular uprising, we were seeing more and more members of the security forces posting videos saying, with my wage, I can't feed my family, and basically cursing the leadership, right? So you're right that they can stay in power. At the same time, the state and the regime are degrading along that trajectory. And the question then becomes, does that alignment of forces, internal opposition and external force, at some point emerge, which is able to defeat a weakened regime? And actually, by the time you reach that point, maybe that's 10, 20 years down the line, is the state strong enough to maintain its cohesion, right?
Well, one last thing to sort of add here is I think the real thing that is just starting to play out, and you saw it with the Mecca agreements in last week, where with the Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Pakistan created a military bloc, or a sort of a self-defense pact. But it shows clearly that the plates are shifting in the entire region, and in ways that if we go back to the world of February 27th, we could not have predicted. And that probably means that we can't predict what it'll be like in 6 months from now. A lot will depend what happened to the Strait of Hormuz. Can the U.S. reestablish deterrence, or sort of more of a sense that the U.S. has that deterrent power that it did on the 27th of February. Obviously there's the elections in Israel, which will be quite important in deciding where we are 6 months from now. But I think it's fair to say that for no one, this is going according to plan. Perhaps with the exception of the Iranians, as they seem to have thought about it in the aftermath of the initial strike on February 28th.
My sense is that with a lot of the investments changes that are happening, it's not necessarily going to be easy for Iran, once it's able to gain control of the Strait of Hormuz, seems to me a probable outcome of the current kind of sequence of events. It's going to be difficult to monetize it, and that it's going to be a diminishing asset. And by the end of the decade, it's a significantly much less both deterrent in military terms, but also financial asset. Right. And so the question is, does the regime seriously have to think about building a nuclear deterrent for its survival? Right. So there's this maneuver by the Islamic Republic after the February 28th. It worked. So to a large extent, the question is, what did it do with it, given that it's a diminishing asset? And the other point is exactly what you mentioned about the emerging kind of my colleagues at Eurasia Group, we were one of the first to write about this towards the end of 2025 and early 2026. Actually, before the war, we called it kind of the Islamic coalition, the one being between this kind of Saudi, Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey. It's not necessarily purely directed against the Islamic Republic. It has some other logics as well, right? At the same time, this is kind of part of the counterbalancing that's happening. And for the time being, it's a mainly defensive, or it's purely defensive alliance. But if the perceived threat and disruption of the Islamic Republic grows over time, then you could see that kind of counterbalancing by both this Islamic coalition as well as what my colleagues at Eurasia Group call the Abraham Coalition, which is kind of Israel, the UAE, and their sets of partners. That counterbalancing by those two actors against Iran on the acts of resistance could intensify. You've already had Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain apparently conduct strikes against Iran. And so those are very initial preliminary signs, but you could also see them become much more powerful defensively. And at that point, Iran's ability to both hold the world economy hostage and the Gulf economy hostage by closing the Strait of Hormuz and striking at GCC critical energy infrastructure. If that's declining over time, then in 3, 4, 5 years, despite winning kind of in the short or medium term, they're in trouble kind of longer term and down the road.
Thank you. Dr. Farzan Sabet, Matt Kaminsky, thank you for a really interesting conversation.